Welcome back to the Parillaworks channel. My name is John. 3 years ago, my wife and I moved into our house down in South Florida. It has a fireplace, even though we have no use for one. It still looks nice and is a focal point in our living room. It's needed a mantel this whole time, and I'm just now getting to that project. We want it to look like a solid wood beam to match the exposed beams on our ceiling. Nothing rustic or barn-like, just a big hunk of wood. This is essentially a beefy floating shelf. The faux beam will slip over a frame that is attached to the wall. To make the beam, I'm going to glue together 4 pieces of ash. The top and bottom will be 3/4 of an inch thick and be resawn from the same piece of 8/4 material. Those pieces will be continuous from end to end, full width and depth. The 2 middle pieces, on the other hand, will each be about 1 3/4 inches thick, and I'll preserve the end grain on each piece but remove a good portion of the rest of the pieces to make a cavity for the frame. After getting the pieces milled down to the proper thickness and width, I could create a template for the inner pieces. I used some CA glue and activator to quickly assemble this template out of plywood. This U shape preserves the end grain of the boards so that the beam will look more authentic. I initially planned to use this template to flush trim against, but realized it would be simpler and quicker to cut out the material with my track saw and jigsaw. Removing this material saved about 6 board feet of material I could use on other projects. It also made this mantel a whole lot lighter in weight. A solid beam would be very heavy and difficult to mount securely. With the 4 pieces ready, I could glue them up. Because I didn't flush trim the pieces, they weren't identical. I planned to build some play into the frame size, so aligning these perfectly wasn't necessary. If this was a rustic piece, I would probably throw some brad nails in here, but for a more refined look, glue is all that's needed. And a lot of clamps. After the glue dried, I took the piece to the joiner to clean up both sides. I wouldn't typically join both sides like this because it could throw the piece out of parallel, but in this case I was removing very little material, so it wasn't a huge concern. Very rarely does my 12-inch miter saw truly come in handy, but cleaning up the ends of this piece was pretty convenient. The blade couldn't make it all the way through, but there was only about 3/8 inch of material left, which was easily cleaned up with a flush trim bit. And you can also get a good look at the end grain of this faux beam. I left the crack in the one middle board, and I really liked the way it turned out. After a little bit of sanding, I could make the frame. This is about as simple as it gets. I used pocket hole screws and glue to attach 6 brackets to the back support. This was all made from a relatively straight 2x4. The 3.5-inch tall frame fits loose enough in the beam to give me some wiggle room during the installation. Before stain and finish, I did a little bit more sanding. I didn't want to add any round edges to this piece, so I just broke the edges by hand, making sure to get rid of any sharp spots. The color of this piece was pretty important. We wanted it to match the beams in our ceiling, as well as some of the other furniture in the room. These were not quite black, but not really brown, sort of a mix of both. I tried a sample of charcoal Rubio monocoat for the first time, but it didn't really color the wood like the website had described. I called an audible and switched to regular stain. The first color was Jacobean. I wipe it on heavy and immediately wipe it off with the grain. It's important to get all of the excess stain off the piece. After that had dried, I added an ebony stain. I used the same process as before, making sure to get all the excess off, wiping off with the grain. These two stains gave us a great color that had a mix of brown and black. For the top coat, we went with a matte, water-based polyurethane. In the past, I've had trouble brushing this type of finish, and wiping it on is almost impossible. I probably could have sprayed it, but I came out with great results using a foam roller. While rolling this polyurethane, it looks like you'll end up with a lot of bubbles, but they eventually level themselves out. Once I finished applying the polyurethane, I rinsed out the roller and went over any heavy spots with the damp roller. This helped to even things out nicely. In all, I only applied 2 coats. The final result is probably the smoothest finish I've ever gotten from a polyurethane and is exactly what we hoped for. The last step was to install the mantel. It was hard to find a relatively flat spot on the wall at the correct height. Because of this, the mantel doesn't sit completely flush, but it's only noticeable if you really look for it. I used Tapcon screws to secure the frame to the wall, making sure to check for level before tightening everything down. Once the frame was secure, I slid the mantel in place and secured it with a few screws from the top into the frame brackets. My wife and I are really happy with how this mantel turned out. I think keeping the end grain really makes this look like an actual beam. Yes, you can see the different boards from the front, but there's always trade-offs to be made. The stain and finish turned out better than I could have hoped for. Pretty soon, probably in like 5 years, I'm going to make a matching coffee table. If you're interested in seeing projects like this while they're in progress, follow me on Instagram at parillaworks. Until next time, thanks for watching.